They think I'm losing my hearing because I've stopped correcting them. It's a common mistake families make when a man reaches 65 and begins to favor silence over the constant, exhausting friction of domestic life. They see the stillness in my face and mistake it for a fog settling over my brain. They see me staring out the window at the oak trees I planted 30 years ago and assume I'm wandering through the corridors of my own memory, lost and senile. I am not lost. I am taking inventory. I built this house. I know every joist, every copper pipe, and every secret groan of the floorboards. I know that the third step from the bottom chirps like a cricket if you step on the left side. I know that if you sit in the dark of the pantry, you can hear a conversation in the dining room as clearly as if you were sitting at the head of the table. For 35 years, I was the head of that table. I was the provider, the protector, the silent engine that kept the lights on and the monsters at bay. I worked double shifts at the firm. I took the hits. I buried my own father without taking a day off, and I made sure my son Julian never knew the weight of a debt or the cold of an empty stomach. But things change when you stop being a source of income and start being a piece of furniture. It was a Tuesday night, heavy with the humidity of a late July heat wave. The air was so thick it felt like breathing through wet wool. Julian and his wife Claire had moved in temporarily 6 months ago after Julian's third business venture collapsed under the weight of his own ego. My wife, Martha, the woman I have shared a bed with for 40 years, had insisted we open our doors. "He's our son Elias," she had said, her voice trembling with that practiced fragility she uses whenever she wants to bypass my logic. "He's drowning." I didn't tell her that sometimes people drown because they refuse to stop holding on to the lead weights they've strapped to their own ankles. I just nodded and opened the door. That Tuesday, I was in the workshop attached to the garage. I wasn't working, I was just sitting in the dark, breathing in the scent of cedar shavings and motor oil, the only scents that don't feel like they belong to someone else's life. The door to the kitchen was cracked open. I heard the clink of wine glasses. Claire's voice, sharp and thin, cut through the evening air like a razor blade through silk. "He's just sitting there again, Julian," she said. I could hear the rhythmic tap of her fingernails on the granite countertop I'd installed with my own calloused hands. "Looking at the wall. It's creepy. It's like living with a ghost that still eats all the groceries." "He's getting older, Claire," Julian replied. There was no defense in his voice, just a tired, oily compliance. "He's earned the right to be a bit vacant." "He hasn't earned the right to stall our lives," Claire snapped. "The doctor said his heart is stable but weary. Do you know what that means? It means he could linger like this for 20 years. 20 years of us living in the guest wing while this 5-bedroom museum sits here rotting around him. Do you realize what the property value is doing? If we don't list it before the market shifts, that inheritance is going to be half of what we projected." I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with my weary heart. Projected. They weren't waiting for me to heal. They weren't even waiting for me to die. They were waiting for me to get out of the way of their math. "Martha is the hurdle," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. "She's sentimental. She thinks he's still the man who built the company." "Martha is tired, Julian," Claire said, and I could hear the predatory grin in her tone. "She's exhausted from playing nursemaid to a man who hasn't said 10 words to her since Christmas. She just needs a push, a reason to see that he'd be safer in a managed environment, somewhere with professionals, somewhere clinical." "He'd hate it," Julian murmured. "He wouldn't know the difference," Claire countered. "He's already gone, Jay. Look at his eyes. There's nobody home. Tomorrow night, when the appraiser comes by under the guise of the insurance inspection, I need you to keep him in the garage. I don't want him wandering into the shot while they're taking photos for the private listing. Then came the sound I didn't expect. The sound that broke the final tether. It was Martha's voice. Quiet. Resigned. I already moved his medication to the top shelf, she said. He can't reach it without asking for help now. It's better this way. He needs to realize he's not in control anymore. It's for his own safety, Julian. Tell Claire to call the appraiser. I sat there in the dark of my workshop, surrounded by tools that were sharper and stronger than the people in the other room. My hand was resting on a heavy steel wrench. For a second, just a second, the old lion in me wanted to roar. I wanted to kick that door open, throw them into the street, and reclaim the kingdom I had bled for. But then the coldness reached my soul, and it brought a strange, terrifying clarity. If they thought I was a ghost, I would give them a haunting they would never forget. If they thought I was the foundation of their future, they had forgotten one simple rule of architecture. A foundation doesn't just hold a house up. If it shifts even an inch, the entire structure screams before it falls. I reached out and quietly turned the dial on my old workbench radio. I didn't turn it up. I turned it off. I stood up, my knees popping in the silence. I didn't feel the weariness Claire had mocked. I felt a sudden surgical focus. They wanted to manage my decline? I would give them a masterpiece of a collapse. But I wouldn't be the one buried in the rubble. I walked to the corner of the workshop where I kept the floor safe, the one Julian didn't know existed, hidden under a pile of old tarps and scrap lumber. I knelt down, my breath steady. Tomorrow the appraiser was coming. Tomorrow they were going to start selling my life. I opened the safe and pulled out a single, thin manila folder. It didn't contain money. It contained the deed to the property in the valley, the one I'd told Martha I'd sold 10 years ago to cover Julian's college debts. I hadn't sold it. I'd paid the debts with my own retirement savings and kept the land. It was 10 acres of nothing but silence and old-growth timber, and more importantly, the bank accounts attached to it were in a trust they couldn't touch, signed by a version of me they thought was long dead. I looked at the kitchen door. I could see their silhouettes through the frosted glass, the three of them, huddled together, carving up my world like vultures over a dying animal. Claire laughed at something Julian said, a sharp, ugly sound. "Don't worry," she said, her voice drifting through the gap. "He won't even notice the sign in the yard. We'll tell him it's a no trespassing notice." I tucked the folder into my coat. I realized then that a father's greatest mistake isn't loving too much, it's letting his family believe his love is a natural resource, like air or water. Something that will always be there, no matter how much they pollute it. I decided right there in the dark that the air was about to run out. The sun rose the next morning with an aggressive, mocking brightness. It spilled across the breakfast table, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Skin cells and debris, the literal remains of a life lived in this house. I sat in my usual chair. Martha was busy at the stove, her back to me. She was making poached eggs, the way she used to when we were celebrating something. The smell, once comforting, now made my stomach turn. It smelled like a final meal. "Coffee's hot, Elias," she said, her voice chirpy, brittle as eggshells. I didn't answer. I just looked at the cabinet above the sink. The small amber bottle of my heart medication was tucked away on the highest shelf, wedged behind a porcelain flower jar I knew Martha hadn't used in a decade. I stood up, slowly, making sure to let my joints groan. I walked over to the cabinet and reached up. I'm 6 feet tall, Or I used to be. Age has a way of stealing an inch here and there, bowing the spine under the weight of things unsaid. I reached, my fingers grazing the wood, intentionally falling short. I felt Martha's shadow fall over me. "Oh, honey, let me," she said, her hand reaching past mine. She grabbed the bottle with an ease that felt like an insult. "You shouldn't be stretching like that. Your heart, remember? The doctor said we have to be careful." She looked into my eyes as she handed me the pill. For a second, I searched for a flicker of the woman who used to press her forehead against mine when the world got too loud. I looked for the girl who had promised to grow old with me in the garden we planted together. There was nothing but a cold, maternal pity. She wasn't looking at her husband. She was looking at a liability. "Thank you," I whispered. My voice sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Julian and Claire are going to be busy today," she said, turning back to the stove. "The insurance man is coming by to do a full inventory for the new policy. They'll be moving through the house, taking photos. It might be a bit loud. Why don't you spend the afternoon in the workshop? I'll bring you some iced tea." "The workshop," I repeated. "It's hot today, Martha." "The fan works, Elias. It'll be peaceful for you." Peaceful. The word they use when they want you to be silent. The word they use for the grave. I swallowed the pill, a placebo of compliance, and walked out to the garage. At 1 p.m., a sleek black SUV pulled into the driveway. A man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped out, carrying a high-end camera and a tablet. Julian met him at the door, shaking his hand with a vigor he usually reserved for people he wanted to borrow money from. Claire was right behind him, wearing her grieving daughter-in-law expression. Muted colors, no jewelry, a practiced slump of the shoulders. I sat on my stool in the workshop, the door cracked just enough to see. They didn't look like people getting an insurance quote. They looked like explorers discovering a new continent, eyes darting toward the crown molding, the hardwood floors, the original stained glass in the entryway. I stood up and moved through the side door of the garage, entering the house through the laundry room. I moved like a shadow. One of the benefits of being ignored is that you become invisible. I stood in the hallway behind the heavy velvet curtains of the dining room. "The master suite is the real selling point," I heard Claire say. Her voice was different now, energetic, greedy. "The vintage soaking tub alone is worth a fortune. Of course, we'll have to strip the wallpaper. It smells like old people." "And the study?" the man asked. His voice was professional, clinical. "My father's office," Julian said. "He hasn't used it in years. It's mostly just clutter now. We're thinking of clearing it out this weekend. We need the space for the staging furniture." "You're sure about the timeline, Mr. Vance?" the appraiser asked. "The market is hot, but a house this size needs a clean exit. If the current resident is still here during showings, it could complicate the empty nest narrative we're trying to sell." There was a pause, a silence so heavy I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, the clock I'd gifted Martha on our 20th anniversary. "He'll be moved by the 1st of the month," Julian said. His voice didn't waver. "We've already scouted the Willows. It's a top-tier facility, high security. He'll have a lovely view of a courtyard. He won't even realize he's left home." "It's for the best, really," Martha's voice joined in. I hadn't realized she was standing right there with them. "He's started forgetting things, small things, but it's a slippery slope. We're doing this for him." I leaned my head against the cold plaster of the wall. The Willows. I knew the place. It was a glorified warehouse for the dying, wrapped in beige paint and the smell of industrial bleach. It was where families sent their problems to be forgotten behind locked doors and high security. "Once the sale closes," Claire whispered, though she didn't need to. They thought I was half deaf and a mile away in the garage. "We can finally put the down payment on the St. Kitts property. Julian, imagine. No more winters. No more this." "It's what Dad would want," Julian said. "He always said he wanted us to be happy." That was the psychological knife. The way they used my own love as a weapon against me. They had twisted my lifetime of sacrifice into a justification for their theft. They weren't just taking my house. They were rewriting my intent. I pulled back from the curtain and retreated to the laundry room. My heart wasn't weary. It was beating with a slow, rhythmic fury. I looked at the dryer. On top of it sat a stack of mail that Julian had filtered for me. On top was a letter from my old law partner, Arthur. It had been opened and taped back shut. Julian had checked it to see if there was money inside. I took the letter and went back to the workshop. I sat down and opened it. Arthur wasn't writing to check on my health. He was writing to tell me that the arrangement we had discussed years ago, the one I'd set up as a break glass in case of emergency plan, was still active. I looked at the folder I'd pulled from the safe the night before. They thought they were the ones playing the game. They thought they were the ones moving the pieces, but they had forgotten who taught them how to play. I reached into a hidden drawer in my workbench and pulled out a small, high-frequency recording device. I'd bought it months ago when I first noticed the hushed tones and the way they stopped talking when I entered the kitchen. I checked the battery. Full. I stood up and walked to the main electrical panel for the house, located in the back of the garage. I knew this system better than the man who installed it. I opened the door and looked at the maze of breakers. If I was a ghost, it was time I started acting like one. I reached for the main breaker for the guest wing, the part of the house Julian and Claire had claimed as their own. With a steady hand, I flipped it. I waited. 5 seconds later, a scream of frustration erupted from the house. Claire's voice. "Julian! The AC just died, and my computer! I was in the middle of the St. Kitts transfer!" I didn't smile. A ghost doesn't smile. I simply walked back to my stool and picked up a piece of sandpaper. I began to rub a piece of scrap wood, the sound a rhythmic shh, shh, shh. They think a father is a permanent structure. They think you can take the bricks out one by one and the roof will never fall. They don't realize that some men aren't the bricks. Some men are the gravity that holds the bricks in place. I heard footsteps running toward the garage. Julian, red-faced and sweating. "Dad, did you touch the breaker box?" he shouted, his voice lacking even a shred of the vacant pity he'd used earlier. I looked at him, my eyes wide and blinking, the mask of the confused old man sliding perfectly into place. "The what, son?" I was just trying to remember where I put the oil for the mower. It's so dark in here. Is the power out?" Julian groaned, a sound of pure disgust. "Just stay here, Dad. Don't touch anything. God, I can't wait for next month." He turned his back on me to fix the breaker. He didn't see me reach into my pocket and pull out the small recording device. He didn't see me tuck it into the underside of his work jacket, which was hanging on the pegboard. He was going to the house meeting tonight with the appraiser to finalize the private listing, and he was going to take me with him. At least, he was going to take my ears. As he flipped the switch and the lights hummed back to life, he looked at me with a sneer. "You're a burden, you know that? A literal, physical burden." He walked away. I waited until the door slammed. Then I picked up the sandpaper again. I had one more thing to do before the sun went down. I had to visit the bank. Not the one where Martha and I had our joint account, the other one. The one they didn't know existed. I waited until I heard Julian's car pull out of the driveway, the gravel spitting under his tires in his usual impatient hurry. A few minutes later, Martha called out that she was heading to her bridge club. She didn't come to the workshop to say goodbye. She just shouted it through the screen door, her voice carrying that forced lightness that people use when they're lying to themselves as much as anyone else. The house fell silent. I stood up and walked to the back of the workshop, where a heavy, dust-covered canvas tarp draped over what everyone assumed was a failed woodworking project from 5 years ago. I pulled the tarp back. It wasn't a table, it was a 1967 Jaguar E-Type, British racing green, polished to a mirror finish. I'd spent 3 years restoring it in secret, late at night while they were asleep or out spending my money. To Julian, it was just a pile of junk under a sheet. To me, it was a getaway vehicle. I didn't take the Jaguar, too loud, too noticeable. Instead, I walked out the back gate of the property, through the wooded path that leads to the old trailhead. I'd parked a nondescript silver sedan there 2 days ago, a car I'd bought in cash through a shell company. I drove 30 minutes into the city, to a part of town where the buildings are made of old stone, and the windows are tinted thick enough to stop a bullet. I pulled up to the curb of a private wealth management firm, not a bank with a teller and a bowl of lollipops, but a place where you need an appointment to even see the lobby. I stepped out of the car. I wasn't wearing my grease-stained overalls anymore. I'd changed into a bespoke charcoal suit I kept in the sedan's trunk. I straightened my tie in the rearview mirror. The man looking back at me wasn't the vacant ghost Claire mocked. He was Elias Vance, the man who had outmaneuvered 3 hostile takeovers before Julian had learned to tie his own shoes. The receptionist didn't ask for ID. She just stood up and nodded. "Mr. Vance? Mr. Sterling is expecting you." Arthur Sterling was my oldest friend, and the only person who knew exactly how much oxygen I actually controlled. He sat behind a mahogany desk that cost more than Julian's first 3 cars combined. "They're doing it, Arthur," I said, sitting down. I didn't need to explain. Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. "I saw the preliminary listing, Elias. They've got it marked as a distress sale. They're trying to move it fast. Julian's been calling my office too. He's asking about the dormant accounts. He thinks there's a second trust." "Is there?" I asked, a ghost of a smile touching my lips. "There are 4, Arthur said, sliding a ledger across the desk. "And the total, well, let's just say Julian's projections for his St. Kitts lifestyle are off by several orders of magnitude. You could buy that island, Elias. You don't need that house." "It's not about the house, Arthur. It's about the foundation. I want to see what happens to them when the floor they're standing on simply ceases to exist." I spent an hour signing papers. I moved every liquid asset out of the joint accounts, leaving exactly enough to cover the mortgage for 30 days. I revoked the power of attorney I'd granted Martha 5 years ago during my minor heart scare. I restructured the ownership of the house so that it wasn't held by me personally, but by a corporation based in the Caymans, a corporation that Julian and Claire were about to accidentally sue if they tried to sell the property. By the time I drove back and tucked the sedan away, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the lawn. I slipped back into my workshop, changed back into my old man clothes, and waited. At 8 p.m., Julian's car returned. He wasn't alone. I heard another car, a sharp electric whine. It was Marcus, my younger son, and his wife, Evelyn. Evelyn. The sister-in-law. If Claire was a razor blade, Evelyn was a sledgehammer wrapped in velvet. She was the one who had convinced Marcus to stop calling me. She was the one who had whispered in his ear that I was hoarding the family's future. I saw them through the workshop window. They were all gathered on the back patio, sitting around the fire pit I'd built for Marcus's graduation. They had a bottle of expensive scotch, my scotch, and they were laughing. I reached for the receiver of the recording device. I'd retrieved the bug from Julian's jacket when he'd come back to the garage to check the breakers earlier. I put on the headphones. The audio was crisp. "So, it's settled?" Evelyn's voice was unmistakable, haughty, dripping with a fake wealthy accent. "We move him to the Willows on the 15th. I've already spoken to the director. They have a memory care wing that's effectively a vault. Once he's in, he's not coming out without a signature from the primary guardian." "And that's me," Julian said, his voice thick with scotch. "Mom's already signed over the medical proxy." "Good," Evelyn said. I could hear the clink of ice against glass. "Because I'm tired of playing nice. Did you see the way he looked at me at dinner last month? Like he knew. He's not as gone as you think, Julian. He's just stubborn." "He's a vegetable, Evelyn," Julian snapped. "Stop being paranoid." "I'm not being paranoid," she hissed. "I'm being thorough. Marcus and I need our share of the liquidation by September. We've already put a deposit on the condo in Aspen. If the old man lingers, or if he has another lucid moment and tries to change the will, we're screwed." "He won't have a lucid moment," Martha's voice joined in. She sounded tired. "I've been doubling his sedative dosage in his evening tea. He'll be asleep by 9 every night from now on." My hand gripped the edge of the workbench so hard the wood groaned. Doubling the dosage. My wife, the woman I had protected for 4 decades, was drugging me to ensure a smoother transition of my own assets to my ungrateful children. "I have a better idea to speed things up," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The Willows is expensive, and the probate period could take months if he just sits there. But if we can prove he's at risk to himself, we can bypass the waiting period for the house sale. Julian, you said he has all those sharp tools in the workshop, right?" "Yeah, why?" "What if he had an accident tonight?" Evelyn asked. "Nothing fatal, just something that proves he can't be left alone for another minute. A small fire, or a fall, something that requires an immediate emergency transfer to a facility." "Evelyn, that's a bit much," Marcus muttered. "Is it?" she countered. "Or do you want to keep living in a rented townhouse while your father sits on a $5 million gold mine? He's 70, Marcus. He's had his life. It's our turn now." There was a long silence. I waited for Julian to protest. I waited for Martha to scream. I waited for someone to remember that I was a human being. "I'll go out there," Evelyn said, her chair scraping the stone. "I'll check on him. I'll make sure the door accidentally locks from the outside. And then I'll knock over one of those kerosene heaters he keeps for the winter. By the time you discover it, the fire department will be here and the case for the Willows will be closed." "Evelyn, wait," Julian started, but his voice lacked conviction. I heard her footsteps. Sharp, piercing, the sound of a hunter approaching a trapped animal. I looked around my workshop. The kerosene heater was in the corner, right where she'd expect it to be. I didn't panic. I didn't run. I realized then that Evelyn had just done me a favor. She hadn't just crossed the line, she had erased it. She had turned a financial dispute into a matter of survival. I reached out and turned the lock on the workshop door myself. Not to keep her out, to keep her in. Because Evelyn didn't know about the second exit, and she certainly didn't know that the old man she was about to frame for an accident had spent 40 years specializing in the laws of self-defense and entrapment. Children rarely notice a father disappearing until the things he paid for start disappearing with him. But tonight, they were going to learn a different lesson. You should never try to burn down a house while the architect is still holding the keys. The lock clicked. It was a soft, metallic sound, but in the tomb-like silence of the workshop, it sounded like a gunshot. I didn't move. I remained slumped in my high-backed wooden chair, my chin resting on my chest, my arms hanging limp at my sides. I practiced the shallow, rhythmic breathing of a man lost in a chemically induced stupor. I could smell her perfume before I heard her footsteps. Something expensive, floral, and entirely too heavy, like lilies at a funeral. Evelyn didn't rush. She moved with the calculated grace of someone who believed she was the only conscious entity in the room. I heard the rustle of her silk blouse as she moved toward the workbench. "Elias?" she whispered. I didn't blink. I didn't twitch. She came closer, her shadow falling over me. I could feel the heat of her presence. She reached out, her gloved hand. She was wearing gardening gloves, I noted, brushing against my shoulder. She gave me a firm shake. "Elias, wake up! You need to go inside." I let out a soft, wet snore, the kind I'd heard my father make in his final months. It was a performance, but it was also a shield. She let out a sharp, jagged exhale, a sound of pure contempt. "Useless," she muttered. "Just a hollowed-out tree taking up space." She turned away from me. I opened my eyes just a fraction, a silver sliver of vision. She wasn't looking for a way to wake me. She was looking for the kerosene heater. It sat in the corner, a vintage red unit I used to keep the dampness out of the wood during the spring rains. Next to it was a small plastic jerry can of fuel. She moved toward it, her movements precise. She didn't just knock it over, she staged it. She moved a stack of dry cedar offcuts, highly flammable, and arranged them in a trail leading from the heater toward the main door. She was creating a fuse. Then she picked up the heater. It was heavy, and she grunted with the effort. She tilted it, letting the fuel spill out in a dark, shimmering pool across the concrete floor. The smell hit me immediately, pungent, oily, and terrifyingly final. I watched her reach into her pocket and pull out a long-reach lighter. This was the moment where the old man was supposed to be the victim of his own clumsiness. The story would be simple. Poor Elias, he was so confused he tried to start the heater and fumbled. It's a miracle we got him out in time. But there was one thing Evelyn didn't know. I wasn't the only one in the workshop who was recording. A month ago, I'd installed a high-definition security camera hidden inside the casing of the wall clock. It was motion-activated, and right now, it was capturing every single one of her movements in 4K resolution. It was uploading the footage in real time to a cloud server that only Arthur Sterling had the password to. Evelyn knelt by the pool of kerosene. She clicked the lighter. The small blue flame flickered, reflecting in her eyes. She looked almost beautiful in that moment, the way a predator is beautiful right before the kill. "You should have just died in your sleep, Elias," she whispered to the empty air. "It would have been so much cleaner for everyone." She lowered the flame toward the cedar shavings. "The ventilation in here is poor, Evelyn," I said. My voice was normal, not a whisper, not a croak. It was the voice of the man who used to command boardrooms. She screamed. It wasn't a cinematic scream, it was a harsh, choked yelp of pure terror. She jerked back, dropping the lighter. It skittered across the floor, the flame extinguishing as it hit the kerosene. Thankfully, the fuel hadn't reached the flash point yet. She scrambled to her feet, her back hitting the workbench. Her eyes were wide, darting toward me, then toward the door. "Elias, you scared me. I thought you were asleep." I stood up. I didn't use the armrests. I stood with a fluidity that I hadn't shown in years. I walked toward her, stepping over the pool of fuel with a casual stride. "I imagine I did," I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small recording device I'd retrieved from Julian's jacket. I held it up so she could see the red light. The audio is quite clear, by the way, especially the part about the memory care wing that's effectively a vault. Her face went from pale to a sickly mottled gray. You were listening? I'm always listening, Evelyn. That's the problem with treating people like furniture.
You forget that furniture stays in the room when you're talking secrets.
She tried to regain her composure, her lip curling into a snarl. It doesn't matter. Look at this place. There's fuel everywhere. My word against yours, Elias. Who are they going to believe? The successful daughter-in-law? Or the senile old man who can't even reach his own heart medication? I pointed to the clock on the wall. The clock has a lens, Evelyn. Wide angle. It's been recording you since you entered. It's currently sending a copy of your performance to my attorney. If you so much as strike a match, the charge shifts from accident to attempted murder and arson. She looked at the clock, then back at me. The bravado vanished. She looked small, shriveled. What do you want? She hissed. I want you to go back to the patio, I said softly. I want you to sit down, finish your scotch, and tell Julian and Marcus that I'm resting peacefully. And then, tomorrow morning, I want you to leave this house. You and Marcus. You're going to find a hotel, and you're never going to step foot on this property again. You can't do that, she stammered. Marcus is your son. This is his inheritance. Marcus is a man who stood by while his wife discussed burning his father alive for a condo in Aspen, I said. The words felt like stones in my mouth. He has no inheritance. Not anymore. I walked to the door, the one I had locked earlier. I turned the key and swung it open. The night air rushed in, cool and sweet, cutting through the stench of kerosene. Go, I said. She stared at me, her eyes filled with a new kind of hatred, the kind that comes from being caught. She didn't apologize. She didn't beg. She just straightened her blouse, wiped her gloved hands, and walked past me. As she reached the threshold, she paused. You think you've won? Martha is the one who's been drugging you, Elias. Your own wife wants you gone. What are you going to do? Lock her out too? Martha is a different conversation, I said. She hates you, Evelyn whispered, leaning in close. She hates the way you look at her. She hates that you're still breathing while her life is passing her by. You're not a hero, Elias. You're just a ghost who refused to leave the haunted house. She disappeared into the darkness toward the fire pit. I stood in the doorway for a long time. I looked at the spill on the floor. I looked at the cedar shavings. She was right about one thing. The foundation was gone. The woman I had loved for 40 years had replaced my medicine with a slow-acting fog. She had looked me in the eye every morning and toasted my demise with a cup of tea. I walked back into the workshop and picked up a rag. I began to soak up the kerosene. A man who has spent his life building things knows exactly how long it takes for a structure to burn. He also knows which exits lead to safety and which ones lead to a cage. Tonight, I had escaped the fire. But as I looked toward the glowing windows of the house I had built for a family that no longer existed, I realized the real haunting hadn't even begun. I reached for the phone in my pocket. I dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Arthur? I said when the line picked up. It's time. Activate the ghost protocol. I want the accounts frozen by dawn, all of them, including the ones Martha thinks are hers. I hung up. I looked at the house one last time. Tomorrow, they would wake up and realize the ATM was closed. But tonight, I had one more thing to do. I had to drink a cup of tea with my wife. The kitchen was bathed in the soft amber glow of the under-cabinet lighting. It looked like the heart of a happy home, clean, warm, smelling faintly of lemon polish and the lavender sachets Martha kept in the linens. I stepped through the laundry room door, my movements intentionally heavy. I let my shoulder graze the doorframe. I let my eyes go slightly glassy, the way they were supposed to look after a day of confusion and weariness. Martha was at the island, her back to me. She was pouring boiling water into a porcelain teapot, the one with the hand-painted cornflowers we'd bought on our honeymoon in the Cotswolds. The steam rose in a delicate plume, obscuring her face for a moment as she turned. "Oh, Elias," she said, her voice a practiced melody of concern. "You're back. I was just about to come look for you. You stayed in the workshop quite late tonight." I didn't mention the kerosene. I didn't mention the camera. I didn't mention Evelyn. "Lost track of time," I murmured. I sat down at the small breakfast table, the wood cool beneath my palms. The wood. It doesn't talk back, Martha. It's easier to listen to. She paused, the teapot hovering over a matching cup. She gave me a sharp, sideways glance, a flicker of the woman who used to read my mind before I could speak. Then the mask of the caregiver slid back into place. "You're tired. I can see it in your eyes." She reached into the small decorative tin next to the kettle. She pulled out a tea bag, but her hand moved with a subtle, practiced sleight of hand toward a small amber vial hidden behind the sugar bowl. I watched her through the reflection in the dark window glass. She didn't know I could see her. She tipped 2 drops of a clear liquid into the bottom of my cup before adding the tea and the water. "Drink this, honey," she said, bringing the cup to the table. "It'll help you sleep. You've been so restless lately, tossing and turning, calling out names in the night." "What names?" I asked, looking up at her. She softened her expression, reaching out to stroke my hair. Her touch, once the only thing that could ground me, now felt like a spider crawling across my scalp. "Just old friends, Elias. People who are gone. You're living in the past too much. It's not good for your heart." I looked down at the tea. The steam smelled of chamomile and honey, but beneath it, I imagined I could smell the clinical bitterness of the sedative. "Where are the kids?" I asked. "They're out on the patio, having a last drink before bed. Marcus and Evelyn are leaving early tomorrow, apparently. Something about a business emergency." She sighed, sitting across from me. "It's a shame. I was hoping we'd all have a big breakfast together. To celebrate." "Celebrate what?" "New beginnings," she said. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her skin was soft, uncalloused, the hands of a woman who had been provided for, protected, and cherished for 40 years. "Life is changing, Elias. We have to change with it. We're getting older. This house is too big. The memories, they're getting too heavy." "A house is only as heavy as the people inside it, Martha." I picked up the cup. I brought it to my lips. I felt her entire body lean in just a fraction of an inch. She was waiting for the swallow. She was waiting for the fog to claim me so she could go back to the patio and tell her children that the problem was safely tucked away. I didn't drink. I let the heat of the steam moisten my face. "I remember when we bought this place," I said, my voice drifting. "You cried because the kitchen was too small. So I tore out the wall. Do you remember that? I spent 3 weeks covered in plaster dust just so you could have a place to bake your bread." Martha's smile faltered. "That was a long time ago, Elias." "It feels like yesterday to me. But I suppose that's part of my condition, isn't it? Forgetting the present, clinging to the past." I set the cup down, untouched. I think I'll take it to the study, I said, standing up. I have a few papers to look over before the insurance people come back tomorrow. Elias, no, she said, her voice sharpening. The tea will get cold. Drink it here. Stay with me. I've stayed with you for 40 years, Martha. 10 minutes in the study won't change that. I picked up the cup and walked out of the kitchen before she could protest. I didn't go to the study. I went to the bathroom in the hallway, poured the tea down the drain, and rinsed the cup thoroughly. Then I walked into my study and locked the door. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. The ghost protocol was a series of automated triggers. At exactly 2 a.m., the joint credit cards, the ones Claire used for her influencer wardrobe and Marcus used for his golf club memberships, would be declined. The overhead line of credit Julian used to float his failing tech firm would be frozen. And the automatic transfer for Martha's private discretionary fund, the one she used to pay the deposit for the Willows, would fail. But the first strike happened sooner than I expected. At 11:15 p.m., there was a frantic pounding on my study door. Julian? Is that you? I heard Martha's voice in the hallway. Mom, something's wrong, Julian was shouting, his voice cracking with a panic I hadn't heard since he was 6 years old and lost in a department store. I just got an alert from the bank. My business account has been flagged for irregular activity. All the funds are restricted. I can't even pay the payroll for Monday. What? That's impossible, Martha said. Maybe it's just a glitch. It's not a glitch, I heard Marcus's voice join in. My card just got declined for the hotel booking tomorrow. And look. I heard the sound of a phone being shoved in front of someone's face. Evelyn just got an email. The trust fund, the one Dad set up for the grandkids, it's been liquidated. The balance is 0. A heavy silence followed. I sat in the dark of my study, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my glasses. I heard Evelyn's voice then, low and dangerous. He did it. He knows. He can't know, Martha whispered. He's been taking his medicine. He's confused. He's not confused, Evelyn screamed. He caught me in the workshop. He has a camera in there. He told me to leave, but I thought he was just rambling. Julian, he's frozen everything. Open the door, Dad, Julian hammered on the wood. Open this door right now. What did you do? You can't just cut us off. That's our money. I stood up and walked to the door. I didn't unlock it. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood. It was never your money, Julian, I said, my voice calm, projecting through the door with the authority of a judge. It was a gift. And a gift can be retracted when the recipient tries to set the giver on fire. Elias! Martha's voice was a sob now, half real, half manipulation. Open the door. Let's talk about this. We're a family. We were a family, Martha, I said. Now we're just a group of people sharing a house that's currently being listed for sale by a corporation you don't own. What are you talking about? Julian yelled. Check your email, Julian. You too, Marcus. You've all been served. Not by me. By the legal entity that owns this property. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises before the private security team arrives to escort you out. You're kicking us out? Marcus gasped. Your own sons? It's the middle of the night. You were planning to put me in a vault, Marcus, I reminded him. A vault with a view of a courtyard. I'm simply giving you the freedom you so clearly craved. You wanted me out of your way, now I am. I'm so far out of your way you'll never see a dime of my weary heart's work ever again. I'll sue you, Julian screamed, kicking the door. I'll have you declared incompetent. Mom will testify. She's been documenting your episodes for months. I looked at the monitor on my desk. The file was ready. I wouldn't do that, Julian, I said. Because if you try to declare me incompetent, I'll release the video of Evelyn spilling kerosene while you and Martha discussed my dosage on the patio.
In a court of law, that's not a record of a senile man. That's a record of a conspiracy to commit elder abuse and arson. The hallway went deathly silent. I could hear Martha's ragged breathing through the door. I could hear the silent realization dawning on them. They had spent months preparing for my end, that they had never prepared for my survival.
"Elias," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, I'm your wife."
My wife died the moment she put those drops in my tea, Martha. You're just a woman living in my house, and your lease just expired. I turned away from the door and sat back down. I picked up a book, an old leather-bound volume of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Outside, the shouting began again, but it was different now. They weren't shouting at me. They were shouting at each other. Claire was blaming Julian. Marcus was yelling at Evelyn. Martha was weeping, her voice a thin, pathetic sound that no longer moved me. They say a father is the pillar of the home, but they forget what happens when the pillar decides it no longer wants to carry the roof. It doesn't scream. It doesn't move. It just stops holding, and the world comes crashing down. The sounds of a collapsing family are surprisingly rhythmic. First comes the denial, the loud percussive shouting, the banging on doors, the frantic pacing that shakes the floorboards. Then comes the blame, the sharp staccato accusations hissed through clenched teeth in the hallway. Finally, there is the silence of the scavengers, the quiet rustle of fabric and the clicking of latches as they realize the ship is sinking and start looking for the lifeboats. I sat in my study and watched them through the security feed on my monitor. The cameras I'd installed weren't just for the workshop. They were tucked into the smoke detectors in every major corridor. I saw Julian slumped against the wall, his face buried in his hands. The image of a man who had finally realized his potential was just a series of debts held together by my signature. I saw Marcus and Evelyn in the guest wing. Evelyn wasn't crying. She was packing. She was throwing her designer shoes into a suitcase with a mechanical, cold efficiency. Marcus was standing in the center of the room, looking around like a man who had woken up in a foreign country without a map. "We have to apologize," I heard Marcus say through the audio feed. "We have to go in there and beg, Evelyn. He's my father. He's just hurt." "He's not hurt, Marcus," Evelyn snapped, not looking up. "He's a predator. He's been playing us for months. He sat there and watched us like we were lab rats. You think an apology is going to fix a man who has frozen your bank accounts and filmed your wife trying to burn his shop? He doesn't want an apology. He wants a funeral. Ours." "But where are we going to go? My credit cards are dead." "I have the emergency jewelry," she said, her voice dropping to a low, jagged whisper. "And the cash I've been skimming from the grocery budget Martha gave me. We're going to a hotel. We're going to call a lawyer. And then we're going to find a way to prove that video was doctored." I leaned back in my chair, skimming from the grocery budget. Even in the face of total ruin, they were still nibbling at the edges of the breadcrumbs. Greed is a hungry guest. It eats the host the moment the larder is empty. I turned my attention to the camera in the master bedroom. Martha was sitting on the edge of our bed, the bed where we had whispered our dreams for our children, where we had comforted each other through the deaths of our parents. She was holding a framed photograph of us on our 30th anniversary. She wasn't weeping anymore. She was staring at my side of the bed. Her expression wasn't one of regret. It was one of profound, terrifying irritation. She looked like a woman who had been inconvenienced by a ghost that refused to leave. "He was always so stubborn," she whispered to the empty room. "Even his heart, it just wouldn't give up. I told them, I told the boys he would be a problem.
She set the photo face down on the nightstand. She reached into her nightstand drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. I knew that notebook. It was her household ledger, except as she flipped through the pages, I saw that it wasn't a record of expenses. It was a timeline. January 12th. Elias forgot his keys, mentioned it to Julian. February 4th. Elias seemed distant at dinner. Good for the narrative. March 20th. Increased dosage to 5 milligrams. He slept for 12 hours. Need to find a way to make it look like a natural decline. She had been journaling my deterioration like a scientist documenting a slow-moving experiment. She wasn't just a passive participant in Julian and Evelyn's greed. She was the architect of the medical evidence. She was building a case for my incompetence, one fabricated episode at a time. I felt a hollow thud in my chest. It wasn't my weary heart. It was the sound of the last remaining bridge in my soul burning to ash. I picked up the house phone and dialed the kitchen extension. I knew she'd hear it. She froze. She looked at the phone on the nightstand as if it were a snake. She slowly reached out and answered. "Elias?" "The ledger, Martha," I said softly. "The one in your hand? Is that the one where you recorded the dates you drugged me? Or is that the one where you decided which of my belongings you'd give to Claire?" She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked around the room, her eyes finally landing on the smoke detector. "You're watching me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "In our bedroom? Elias, that's a violation. That's sick." "A violation?" I asked. "Is it more of a violation than putting sedatives in a man's tea so you can sell his house out from under him? Is it more of a violation than lying to a doctor about the mental state of the man you swore to honor and cherish?" "I did it for the family," she screamed, the mask finally shattering. "I did it because you wouldn't let go. You were hoarding everything, Elias. The money, the control, the house. You were sitting on a mountain of gold while your sons were struggling." "Struggling?" I repeated. "Julian has lived in luxury his entire life on my dime. Marcus hasn't worked a 40-hour week in 5 years. They aren't struggling, Martha. They're just bored. And you were so bored you decided to become a widow while I was still breathing." "You were never here!" she shrieked. "Even when you were in the room, you were somewhere else, working, thinking, building. You didn't need me. You didn't need any of us. You just needed an audience." "Well," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt like ice. "The show is over, Martha. The audience is being evicted. I want you out of my room. Now. Go to the guest wing with your children. I don't want to see your face in this part of the house again." "You can't do this, Elias. I'm your wife. I have rights." "You have the right to a very expensive divorce attorney," I said. "And you have the right to explain to a judge why you were administering unprescribed medication to your husband. I've already sent the digital copy of your ledger to Arthur, along with the footage from the workshop." I hung up. I watched the monitor. Martha threw the phone across the room. It shattered against the wall. She began to pack, her movements frantic, ugly. An hour later, the house went quiet. I heard the front door open and close 4 times. I heard the cars start. The muffled roar of Julian's SUV, the whine of Marcus's sedan. They were gone. For now. I knew they weren't finished. They would go to a hotel. They would talk to lawyers. They would try to find a loophole in the corporate ownership of the house. They would try to weaponize my age one last time. But they had forgotten the most important rule of the game they were playing. They were playing for the inheritance. I was playing for the truth. I stood up and walked out of my study. The house felt massive, cold, and strangely light, as if the weight of their resentment had been lifted from the rafters. I walked into the kitchen. The teapot was still there, cold now. The porcelain cornflowers seemed to mock me. I walked to the sink and began to wash the cups. One by one, I scrubbed them until my hands were red. Then, I saw it. On the kitchen island, tucked under the fruit bowl, was a small handwritten note I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't from Martha. It wasn't from Julian. It was from my granddaughter Lily, Julian's 7-year-old daughter. Grandpa, it read in shaky, colorful crayon. Daddy says we have to move to the islands. He said you're going to a special hotel where you can sleep all day. Will you still come to my birthday? I saved you a piece of my invisible cake. I stared at the paper. The invisible cake. The cruelty of my children had reached even the heart of a child. They hadn't just betrayed me. They had poisoned the well for the next generation. They had told her I was leaving her. They had made me the villain in her story so they could be the heroes of their own greed. I folded the note and tucked it into my pocket. The coldness in my soul hardened into something else. Something sharper. Something final. They thought I had just cut off their money. They didn't realize I was about to dismantle their reputations. I picked up my cell phone and made one last call before the sun came up. Arthur? Change of plans, I said. Don't just freeze the accounts. I want a full forensic audit of Julian's tech firm. Every cent, every business expense. And I want the same for Marcus's consulting firm. Elias, Arthur's voice was hesitant. That will lead to an IRS investigation. Julian could face prison time for those offshore transfers he made last year. I looked at Lily's note on the counter. Then he'll have plenty of time to sleep, I said. And Arthur, call the local news. Tell them a prominent local philanthropist is making a historic announcement tomorrow regarding the Vance estate. I want a camera crew on my lawn by noon. I hung up and walked to the front door. I stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, the first light of dawn beginning to bleed through the trees. I sat in my rocking chair. I didn't feel like a ghost anymore. I felt like the man who was about to set the world on fire. Just to see which of them would try to save the child instead of the gold. The silence of an empty house isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of all the words you can no longer say. I walked through the hallways as the sun began its slow climb, casting long, skeletal shadows across the hardwood. The house felt lighter, yes, but it also felt hollowed out, like a rib cage with the heart removed. I passed Julian and Claire's room. They had left in such a hurry that a drawer had been pulled completely out of the dresser, lying face down on the floor like a fallen soldier. A single silk scarf, vibrant red, was snagged on the corner of the nightstand, fluttering slightly in the draft. They were scavengers to the very end. They hadn't just taken their clothes, they had taken the silver lamps I'd bought in Florence. They had taken the crystal decanter from the library, small, petty thefts that spoke volumes about the scale of their desperation. I went into Julian's home office. This was the sanctuary of the tech visionary. It was filled with ergonomic chairs, curved monitors, and ego. I sat in his chair. It was too soft, lacking the structural integrity of the wooden stool in my workshop. My phone vibrated on the desk. Arthur. I have the first wave of the audit, Elias, he said. His voice sounded like he'd been up all night, which he had. It's worse than we thought. Julian wasn't just floating his firm with your line of credit. He was using Lily's educational trust as collateral for high-interest private loans. I felt the air leave my lungs. He was gambling with his daughter's future? He was double leveraging it, Arthur said, his voice dropping into a professional monotone to mask his disgust. And there's more. Marcus, your consulting son, he's been billing your estate for property management services for 3 years. He's been charging you $10,000 a month to basically exist. Martha was the one signing the checks. I looked out the window. A black van with a satellite dish on top was pulling up to the edge of the driveway, just outside the perimeter gate. They didn't just want the inheritance, Elias, Arthur continued. They were actively cannibalizing you while you were still standing. They were worried that if you lived another 10 years, there wouldn't be enough left for them to live the way they wanted. They were accelerating your decline because your life was becoming a financial liability. Thank you, Arthur. Did you contact the Charitable Foundation? I did. They're stunned, but they're ready. The paperwork for the donation of the Vance estate is being finalized as we speak. And the news crew? They're outside your gate. Elias, are you sure about this? Once you do this, there is no going back. You won't just be cutting them off, you'll be making them pariahs in this city. They'll never work in finance or tech again. They stopped being my children when they started measuring me for a coffin, I said. Keep the audit files ready. I want the IRS to have a copy by noon. I hung up and stood. I went to the mirror in the hallway and straightened my tie. I looked at the man in the glass.
The vacant look was gone. The weary heart was beating with a cold, steady rhythm. I walked down the stairs and out onto the front porch. The morning air was brisk. I could see the news crew setting up their tripod. I could also see 3 cars parked haphazardly behind the news van. Julian's SUV, Marcus's sedan, and a third car I didn't recognize, likely a lawyer. I signaled to the private security guard I'd hired through Arthur's firm. He tapped a code into the gate. The heavy wrought iron doors hummed as they swung open. Immediately, the family surged forward, ahead of the cameras. They looked like a different species in the harsh morning light. No more polished veneers. Julian's shirt was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. Claire was wearing sunglasses, but she couldn't hide the tension in her jaw. Martha was at the back, looking small and fragile, clutching a handkerchief. They stopped at the edge of the porch, blocked by the security guard. "Dad!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking. "We need to talk! This has gone too far! You've frozen the accounts! We couldn't even get a hotel room last night! We had to sleep in the car!" "Is that so?" I said, my voice carrying clearly to the news crew, who were now filming everything. "A man with a $5 million tech firm couldn't find a place to sleep? Or is it that the firm only exists on paper, Julian? Paper that belongs to your daughter's trust?" Julian went pale. He glanced at the camera, then back at me. "Shut up. Just shut up. Let's go inside." "You don't live here anymore, Julian," I said. "And neither does anyone else. This house no longer belongs to the Vance family." Martha pushed through the boys, her face a mask of grief. "Elias, please. This is our home. Whatever I did it out of fear for you. You weren't yourself." "You're right, Martha," I said, stepping down one stair. "I wasn't myself. I was a provider. I was a safety net. I was a man who believed that love was enough to keep a family honest. I was wrong." I turned my attention to the camera. The reporter, a young woman with a sharp, hungry expression, held out a microphone. "Mr. Vance, can you confirm the rumors? Is it true you're liquidating the entire Vance estate today?" "I am," I said, looking directly into the lens. "But I'm not selling it. Today, I am announcing the creation of the Lily Vance Foundation for Victims of Elder Abuse. I am donating this house, this land,
and the entirety of my liquid assets, totaling approximately $42 million, to the foundation. A collective gasp went up from the group at the bottom of the stairs. Julian looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Marcus actually slumped against the railing. 42 million? Claire shrieked, her voice a jagged glass shard. That's not possible. You told us there was only 10. I told you what you needed to hear to reveal your true colors, Claire, I said. And you didn't disappoint. You can't give it away, Marcus yelled, stepping toward the guard. That's our birthright. You're senile. You're clearly not in your right mind. On the contrary, Marcus, I said, pulling a folded document from my pocket. I've spent the last 6 months undergoing secret, third-party psychiatric evaluations at the State University. I have 3 separate certificates of mental competency, all dated within the last 30 days. I also have the recordings of last night's festivities. I looked at Martha. The ledger, Martha. The one where you kept track of the drugs. It's been digitized. The foundation will use this house as a headquarters to help other men and women whose families try to bury them while they're still breathing. Your legacy will be the very thing that protects others from people like you. The reporter was scribbling frantically. This wasn't just a local story anymore. This was a national scandal in the making.
What about us?
Martha whispered, her voice trembling. Elias, where are we supposed to go? We have nothing. I looked at her. I looked for the woman I had loved. She wasn't there. There was just a stranger who had tried to dim my light so she could live in the shadows of my hard work. You have the clothes on your backs, I said. And Julian, you have that forensic audit I just sent to the authorities. I suggest you use whatever cash you have left to find a very good criminal defense attorney. You're going to need it when the IRS asks about the educational trust. I turned to walk back into the house. Wait! Julian screamed. What about Lily? You're her grandfather. You're going to let her starve? You're going to let her grow up with nothing because you're mad at us? I paused at the door. I reached into my pocket and felt the crinkle of the invisible cake note. Lily is the only one who is staying, I said, not turning around. I've set up a private guardianship. She'll have everything she needs. But she'll grow up knowing that her father didn't provide it. Her grandfather did. And she'll grow up in a world where the name Vance means something more than just greed. I stepped inside and closed the heavy oak door. I heard them screaming outside. I heard the reporter asking more questions. I heard the sound of Julian's SUV peeling away in a desperate, futile rage. I walked into the kitchen and sat at the table. I looked at the empty chair across from me. For the first time in 40 years, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. But as I sat there, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a cold, heavy ache in its place. I had won. I had dismantled the structure. I had protected my legacy. Then, the phone on the wall rang. It was the internal line from the gatehouse. Mr. Vance, the security guard said, There's someone else here. She says she's not with the family. She says she has something you dropped in the workshop last night. I frowned. Who is it? She says her name is Sarah. She says she was the nurse your wife hired to check on you last month. The one who was fired after 3 days. I remembered her. A quiet girl, kind eyes. She'd been let go because Martha said she was incompetent. Let her in, I said. I waited in the kitchen. A few minutes later, the door opened. Sarah didn't look like a scavenger. She looked tired. She was holding a small digital recording device. Not mine. Mr. Vance, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't want to come. I was scared. But I heard the news on the radio. What is that, Sarah? It's from the night I was fired, she said, laying the device on the table. I didn't leave because I was incompetent. I left because I heard what they were planning to do to your heart. And I realized they weren't just drugging you, Elias. She looked at me with a pity that felt real, and it terrified me more than the betrayal. "They weren't just trying to make you sleep," she said. "They were waiting for the event. And Sarah, she wasn't the only one Martha was talking to." My blood turned to ice. "What event?" "The one your brother helped her set up." I froze. I don't have a brother. My brother, Silas, died 20 years ago, or so I had been told. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen had been vacuumed out by the sheer weight of Sarah's words. I looked at the digital recorder on the table. It was a cheap, plastic thing, yet it looked like an unexploded grenade. "My brother is dead, Sarah," I said. My voice was a ghost of itself, hollow and rattling. "Silas died in a boating accident off the coast of Maine 20 years ago. I identified the remains. I paid for the headstone." "Did you see his face, Mr. Vance?" Sarah asked softly. She didn't look away. "Or did you just see a dental record and a ring? Because the woman I heard on the phone, your wife, she didn't sound like she was talking to a ghost. She sounded like she was talking to a partner." I felt a cold sweat break across my neck. I remembered that day in Maine. The fog had been so thick you couldn't see your own hands. The boat had been found capsized, shattered against the rocks. The body they pulled out was bloated, unrecognizable. But it was wearing Silas's signet ring. The coroner, a man who had since retired to a villa in Spain, a villa I now realized might have been funded by a Vance check, had confirmed the identity within hours. I reached out and pressed play on the recorder. The audio was grainy, filled with the background hum of a television and the clinking of ice. Then, Martha's voice came through. It wasn't the brittle, weeping voice she had used on the porch. It was low, intimate, and chillingly pragmatic. "He's holding on longer than we expected, Silas," Martha said. "The dosage is at the limit. If I go any higher, the tox report will flag it. We need the event to happen before the audit. Julian is making mistakes. He's getting sloppy with the offshore transfers." A man's voice replied, a voice that sent a shiver of prehistoric recognition down my spine. It was a baritone, smooth as bourbon and just as toxic. "Silas." "Julian was always a weak link," the voice said, "just like his father. Elias always had a sentimental streak for the foundation. He doesn't realize that a foundation is just a hole in the ground you fill with money. Don't worry, Martha. Once the life insurance pays out on the 20th anniversary of my death, the double indemnity clause triggers. Between that and the estate liquidation, you'll have enough to disappear. We both will." "And the boys?" Martha asked. "They're pawns," Silas replied. "Let them fight over the scraps of the tech firm. By the time the dust settles, we'll be in Zurich. Just keep him quiet for 10 more days, that's all we need." The recording ended with a click. I sat there, staring at the cornflower pattern on the teapot. The world didn't just feel cold. It felt fake. The last 20 years of my life, the mourning of my brother, the supporting of his widow, who I had sent monthly stipends to for a decade, the guilt I felt for being the successful one, it was all a script. Silas hadn't died. He had staged his exit to escape the massive embezzlement charges he was facing at the time, and Martha, my Martha, had helped him. They had used me as a bank, a shield, and eventually, a target. "Why are you telling me this now, Sarah?" I asked, my eyes finally moving to hers. "You could have gone to the police. You could have blackmailed them." "I'm a nurse, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice steady. "I took an oath to do no harm. When I saw what she was putting in your tea, I tried to stop her. She threatened me. She said if I spoke up, she'd use her connections to have my license revoked. But seeing you on that porch today, seeing you stand up,
I realized you're the only one who can actually stop them. They think you're a victim. They don't know you're the architect. I stood up. My knees didn't pop this time. The weariness was gone, replaced by a crystalline, predatory focus. 10 days, I whispered. The 20th anniversary of his death is next Friday. What are you going to do? Sarah asked. A man can survive a knife in the back if he knows who's holding it, I said, looking out the window at the empty driveway. But what do you do when the knife has been there for 20 years and you've been calling it a scar? I walked to the study. I didn't call Arthur this time. This wasn't a legal matter anymore. This was a ghost hunt. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. Inside was Silas's signet ring, the one the coroner had handed me in Maine. I had kept it as a memento. I took a magnifying glass from the desk and examined the inside of the band. There, in microscopic engraving, was a serial number. It wasn't a jeweler's mark.
It was a tracking code for a high-end GPS recovery system Silas had insisted on for all his precious items. He'd told me it was for insurance. I'd never bothered to check if it was active. Why would I? Dead men don't move. I opened my laptop and entered the code into a private recovery site I still had access to from my days in corporate security. The screen flickered. A map of the world appeared. A red dot began to pulse. It wasn't in Zurich. It wasn't in Spain. The dot was pulsing 3 miles away, in a gated community on the other side of the valley. A house owned by a holding company that Marcus had been managing for the last 5 years. The event wasn't just my death. It was a reunion. My brother had been living in my shadow, eating my food and sleeping in a house I paid for, while my wife tucked me into bed with a cup of poison. I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, a dry, hacking sound that had no joy in it. They thought they were the predators. They thought they had outsmarted the old man. But they had forgotten one thing about ghosts. A ghost doesn't have anything left to lose. I picked up the phone and dialed Julian. He answered on the first ring, his voice desperate. "Dad? Look, I'm sorry about the porch. We were just—" "Julian," I interrupted, my voice smooth as silk. "I've changed my mind. I've realized I was too harsh. The foundation. It was an emotional reaction. I want to settle this, tonight, family only." "Really?" I could hear the greed reigniting in his voice. "You mean it?" "Bring your mother," I said, "and Marcus, and Evelyn. We'll meet at the lake house in the valley, the one Marcus manages. I want to see it one last time before I sign the final papers." "The lake house? But why there?" "Because," I said, looking at the pulsing red dot on my screen, "it's time we brought everything out of the shadows. I have a surprise for your mother. Something she's been waiting 20 years for." I hung up. I looked at Sarah. "Go home, Sarah. Turn off your phone. Don't look at the news until tomorrow morning." "Mr. Vance, please be careful." "Careful is for people who want to live, Sarah," I said, picking up my car keys. "I just want to be finished." I walked out to the garage and uncovered the 1967 Jaguar. The engine roared to life, a deep, guttural snarl that echoed off the walls. I didn't drive like an old man. I drove like a man who was finally on time for his own execution. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw the news van still idling at the gate. I didn't stop. I sped past them, the British racing green blurring into the dark forest. I had spent my life building a foundation of truth. Tonight, I was going to see how much weight a lie can carry before it snaps the neck of the person telling it. I reached the gates of the Valley Estate 20 minutes later. I didn't use the code. I drove through the wooden arm of the security gate, shattering it. I parked the car in front of the modern glass-fronted house. The lights were on. I could see silhouettes moving inside. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting my face. I reached into my pocket and felt the weight of the signet ring. I walked to the front door and pushed it open. "Honey, I'm home," I whispered to the empty foyer. From the top of the stairs, I heard a gasp. Not from Martha. It was a man's voice.
Elias?
I looked up. Standing there, looking exactly as he had 20 years ago, only with a tan that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, was my brother. But he wasn't alone. Martha was standing next to him, her hand resting on his arm in a way she hadn't touched me in a decade. "You're late for tea, Elias," Silas said, a smirk spreading across his face. "But don't worry, we saved you a seat." The house was a masterpiece of glass and steel, a transparent cage perched on the edge of the valley. It was the kind of architecture that promised honesty while providing nowhere to hide. Yet it had served as the perfect shroud for a man who had been a ghost for 2 decades. I stood in the foyer, the heavy brass key to my own house still warm in my pocket. I looked up at them. Silas looked healthy, infuriatingly so. The sun of whatever tropical bolt hole he'd been hiding in had bronzed his skin, and the expensive linen shirt he wore was unbuttoned at the collar, radiating a leisure I hadn't known in 40 years. Martha's hand was still on his forearm. She didn't pull it away when I looked at her. In fact, she tightened her grip. The woman who had wept on my porch that morning, playing the victim for the news cameras, was gone. In her place stood a woman who looked like she had finally come home. "You look well, Silas," I said. My voice didn't shake. It had the steady, rhythmic quality of a metronome. "The Atlantic was very kind to your complexion for a man who drowned in it." "The Atlantic is a vast place, Elias," Silas said, stepping down the first stair. His movements were fluid, arrogant. "Plenty of room for a man to disappear if he has the right help, and the right motivation." "Motivation," I repeated. "Is that what we're calling embezzlement and cowardice these days?" Silas laughed, a sound like dry gravel. "I prefer to call it early retirement. You were always the one who wanted the burden, Elias. The firm, the reputation, the big house with the creaky floors. You loved being the martyr. You loved the way everyone looked at you as the foundation. I just figured I'd let you have it. All of it. Including the bill." "And Martha?" I asked, my eyes shifting to her. "Was she part of the bill?" Martha finally spoke. Her voice was cold, devoid of the maternal warmth she had used to weaponize my own children against me. "You never saw me, Elias. You saw a wife. You saw a hostess. You saw a mother for your sons, but you never saw me. Silas saw me, even from the shadows, even when he was a name on a headstone. He was more present in my life than you were, sitting across the dinner table." The psychological insight hit me then, a dull ache behind my ribs. A man who provides everything often forgets that the one thing people cannot be bought is the feeling of being necessary. I had made myself so strong that she felt redundant. So she chose the man who needed her to hide him. "So you spent 20 years waiting," I said. "Waiting for me to die. Waiting for the insurance to trigger, using the money I earned to fund the man who betrayed me." "It wasn't just your money, Elias," Silas said, reaching the bottom of the stairs. He stood a few inches taller than me, his physique maintained by a life of stolen luxury. "It was the Vance legacy. I'm a Vance too. I just didn't want to work for it. Why should I, when you were so happy to do it for both of us?" The sound of tires on gravel interrupted us. Two sets of headlights swept across the glass walls of the living room.
"The boys are here," Martha said, a flicker of genuine anxiety crossing her face. "Elias, don't make this harder than it has to be. Sign the papers for the lake house. Let us go. You have your foundation. You have your truth. Just let us disappear."
"Is that what you told Marcus?" I asked. "When you had him manage this property through a shell company? Did he know his Uncle Silas was drinking my scotch in the library while I was mourning at an empty grave?"
The front door swung open.
Julian and Marcus burst in, Claire and Evelyn trailing behind them. They stopped dead in the foyer. Julian's jaw literally dropped. He looked at Silas, then at Martha, then at me.
What is this? Who is this guy?"
Julian didn't know. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Martha had kept the secret even from her eldest. But Marcus didn't look surprised. He looked terrified. He stayed near the door, his eyes darting between me and Silas.
"Marcus,"
Julian breathed, turning to his brother.
"Who is this? He looks like the pictures of Dad's brother."
"It's Silas, Jay," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. He didn't die. Mom told me 5 years ago. We needed a place for him to stay. The lake house was the only asset Dad didn't track closely." "You knew?" Julian screamed, lunging at Marcus. "You knew he was alive while I was struggling to keep the firm afloat? You knew, and you didn't tell me?" "Mom said it would protect the inheritance," Marcus yelled back, shielding his face. "She said if Dad found out, he'd cut everyone off. I was trying to save us, Julian." "Save us?" Julian laughed hysterically. "Look at him! He's been living in a palace while we've been begging for scraps. Dad, did you know? Did you know Marcus was hiding him?" "I found out an hour ago," I said. I looked at my family, the web of secrets, the layers of betrayal, the sheer, staggering depth of their entitlement. They were tearing each other apart in front of a man they thought was a ghost and a man they thought was a fool. "Enough!" Silas barked. The room went silent. He had always been the loud one, the one who could command a room with a look. "It doesn't matter who knew what. The event is still on schedule. Elias, you're going to sign the transfer of the Valley estate to Martha. Now. And then you're going to walk out of here and go to your Willows facility like a good little martyr." "And if I don't?" I asked. Silas reached into the pocket of his linen jacket and pulled out a small, silver remote. "I didn't just spend 20 years hiding, brother. I spent it learning. Marcus, tell your father what's under the floorboards of his precious workshop back at the main house." Marcus looked like he was going to vomit. "Dad, I'm sorry. They made me do it. The insurance inventory last week. It wasn't for the house. We installed a gas main bypass. One spark, one click of that remote, and the workshop, the garage, and everything in it. It's gone."
"My workshop," I whispered. "My tools, the Jaguar, the 4K camera hidden in the clock."
"The evidence is in that shop, Elias," Martha said, her voice trembling now. "The recordings, the ledgers, you said they were there. If you don't sign, Silas will level it. You'll have no proof. You'll just be a senile old man who accidentally blew up his own garage while playing with kerosene." I looked at the remote in Silas's hand. I looked at Martha's cold eyes. I looked at Marcus's cowardice and Julian's shattered ego. The hardest part of being the foundation isn't the weight of the house. It's the silence of the people inside who forget you are the reason they aren't sinking into the mud. "You're right," I said, stepping forward. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pen. "I'll sign." "Dad, no!" Julian cried. "Be quiet, Julian," I said. I walked to the glass coffee table where a stack of legal documents waited. I leaned over and signed my name, not once, but 4 times, on the transfer deeds. Silas grinned. He reached for the papers. Smart man, Elias. Always the pragmatist. I handed him the papers, but as he took them, I gripped his wrist. My hand, though old, was still strong from years of manual labor. There's one thing you forgot, Silas, I whispered, loud enough for the whole room to hear. What's that? He sneered. I'm a master of foundations, and I know that if you're going to destroy a structure, you have to be sure you aren't standing inside it. I looked at the glass walls of the house. I looked at the digital clock on the wall. The event isn't on Friday, Silas, I said, and the bypass Marcus installed isn't at the main house. I spent 2 hours in the basement of this house before you arrived tonight, while Sarah kept you distracted with her phone call. The color drained from Silas's face. He looked at the remote. I didn't just sign those papers, Silas, I said, releasing his wrist. I activated the secondary trigger, the one I wired into the security system of this house. You thought you were the only one who could play with gas. A low subterranean hum began to vibrate through the floor. It wasn't a loud sound. It was the sound of a foundation shifting. The remote in your hand doesn't lead to my workshop, I said, backing toward the front door. It leads to the basement of this glass cage, and I've already set the timer. I looked at Martha. You wanted to be with him, Martha. You wanted to live in the shadows. Now, you get to stay in them forever. I turned and walked out the front door. Elias, wait! Martha screamed. I didn't stop. I walked to the Jaguar. I didn't look back. I got in, started the engine, and put it in gear. Behind me, the glass house was illuminated by a sudden, brilliant white light. The white light didn't come with a roar. It came with the deafening, rhythmic strobing of reality. I sat in the driver's seat of the Jaguar, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, the glass house wasn't a fireball. It was a stage. The brilliant light wasn't an explosion of gas. It was the simultaneous ignition of 24 high-intensity tactical floodlights I'd had installed along the perimeter of the Valley estate 3 days ago, under the guise of security upgrades for the holding company. And then came the sirens. A low, mournful wail that grew into a piercing scream as 4 black SUVs crested the hill, their blue and red lights cutting through the artificial white glare. I hadn't rigged the house to blow. I had rigged it to be seen. I watched through the glass walls as Silas froze, the remote in his hand suddenly looking like the toy it was. He looked at the window, then back at the remote, his thumb hovering over the button. He pressed it. Once. Twice. Nothing happened to my workshop. Instead, the secondary trigger I'd mentioned activated the house's internal PA system, a system I'd linked to the recording Sarah had given me and the audio I'd captured in the workshop. Martha's voice, amplified to a thunderous volume, began to echo across the valley. The dosage is at the limit. We need the event to happen before the audit. Silas, don't worry. We'll disappear. It was a public confession, broadcast to the local police, the federal agents I'd alerted, and the news crew that had followed my distress signal to the property. I saw Martha collapse onto the designer sofa, her face buried in her hands. I saw Silas try to run toward the back exit, only to be met by a wall of agents in tactical gear. I saw Julian and Marcus standing in the center of the room, their hands raised, looking like children caught in a game of hide-and-seek they didn't realize was being played for keeps. I put the Jaguar in gear and slowly drove toward the gate. I didn't need to see the handcuffs. I didn't need to hear the Miranda rights. I had spent 40 years being the man who fixed things in silence. Tonight, the silence was over. but the fixing was finally complete. As I passed the lead police cruiser, a man in a trench coat signaled for me to stop. It was Detective Miller, a man I'd known for years through the firm. He leaned into the window, his breath visible in the cool night air. "We have them, Elias," he said, his voice tempered with a grim respect. "The brother, too. We've already confirmed his identity. It's a mess, Elias. A hell of a mess." "It's just a house, Detective," I said. "The mess was already there. I just turned the lights on." "Your wife, she's asking for you. She's hysterical." I looked toward the glass house. Martha was being led out, her silk blouse torn at the shoulder, her eyes wild. She saw the Jaguar. She saw me. For a moment, the screaming stopped. She just stared at me through the windshield, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "I have nothing to say to her," I said, "and she has 40 years of my silence to listen to now. I think that's a fair trade." I drove away. I didn't go back to the main house. I couldn't, not yet. The air there would still smell like chamomile and betrayal. Instead, I drove to the small cottage on the edge of the property, the one I'd built for my parents before they passed. It was small, sturdy, and honest. I sat on the porch as the first hint of blue began to stain the horizon. The psychological weight of the night began to settle on me. I had won. My brother was alive and headed for a cage. My wife was a conspirator. My sons were revealed as the hollow shells I had feared they were. But as I sat there, I realized the most devastating truth of all. A father can build a fortress to protect his children, but he can never build a wall high enough to keep out the things they choose to become. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the signet ring I'd taken from the safe. I looked at it, the symbol of the Vance family, of the legacy Silas had mocked. I walked to the edge of the porch and dropped it into the tall grass. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Arthur. "Accounts fully secured. The forensic audit of Julian's firm is in the hands of the DA. He's going to be charged with grand larceny by morning. Marcus is being held for questioning regarding the concealment of a fugitive. Elias, are you okay?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how to define okay. I was a man who had successfully dismantled his own life to save his soul. I went inside the cottage. It was dusty, the furniture covered in white sheets. It looked like a graveyard for memories. I pulled the sheet off the small kitchen table and sat down. I realized then that I had one final task. The ghost protocol wasn't just about money or lawyers. It was about the child, Lily. She was still at the main house, likely being cared for by the nanny I'd hired through a private agency 2 days ago. A woman who answered to me, not Julian or Claire. I picked up the phone and called the house. "Is she awake?" I asked when the nanny answered. "She's in the garden, Mr. Vance. She's looking for you. She said you promised her a piece of cake." I felt a crack in the ice around my heart. "Tell her I'm coming. And tell her the hotel I was going to was canceled. I'm staying home." I hung up and stood. I felt older than the trees outside, yet lighter than I had in decades. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard a sound that stopped me cold. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. I turned. Standing on the porch of the cottage, her face pale in the pre-dawn light, was Claire. She wasn't in handcuffs. She hadn't been at the Valley House when the police arrived. She must have slipped away the moment she saw the lights. She didn't look angry. She looked terrified. And in her hand, she was holding a small, leather-bound book. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't Martha's ledger. It was a different book, one I hadn't seen in years. It was my father's diary, the one I thought had been lost in the accident 20 years ago. "You missed a page, Elias," Claire whispered through the glass, her voice trembling. You thought Silas was the only one with a secret, but you never asked why your father was on that boat in the first place. I stared at her. The foundation I had just rebuilt began to tremble. "Open the door, Elias," she said, her eyes darting toward the driveway. "Before the others get here, you think you finished them? You've only just started the war." I stared at the leather-bound book in Claire's hand. The edges were frayed, the gold leaf of the V for Vance worn away by years of being hidden in the dark. I didn't open the door. I simply stood there, watching her through the glass.
My father loved the truth, Claire, I said, my voice barely a vibration against the pain. He spent his life teaching me that a man is only as tall as his word. Your father loved the family, Elias, Claire countered, her voice shaking with a desperate, frantic energy. And he knew that Silas was the only one who had the stomach to do what was necessary to keep the Vance name from going under in the 80s. That boating accident? It wasn't just Silas's exit. It was your father's final investment. He bought the boat. He paid the coroner. He chose you to be the face of the legacy because you were the only one who was too honest to look for the bodies in the basement. She pressed the book against the glass, flipping it open to a page dated June 14th, 20 years ago. The handwriting was unmistakable. The sharp, upright script of my father, a man I had worshipped as a saint of industry. Silas is gone. It cost more than the insurance will return, but Elias must never know. He is the foundation. He is the one who believes. If the foundation knows the house is built on a lie, the whole structure will crumble. God forgive me for making a martyr of my best son. The words didn't hit me like a blow. They hit me like a slow, freezing tide. The silence I had cultivated, the sacrifice I had made, the decades of carrying the weight of a distinguished name. It wasn't just that my wife and sons were scavengers. It was that the very man who taught me to be the pillar had been the one to hollow me out. I wasn't the architect of this family. I was the load-bearing wall in a house of cards. "Give me the money, Elias," Claire whispered, her face inches from mine, separated only by the glass. 1 million. That's all I want. I'll give you the diary and I'll walk away. You can keep your truth. You can keep being the hero who caught the villains. If the world finds out your father was a criminal, the Lily Vance Foundation becomes a joke before the first check is signed. I looked at her, at the greed, the fear, and the sheer exhausted ugliness of a person who thinks everything in life is a transaction. I reached out and turned the deadbolt. I opened the door. Claire's eyes lit up. She stepped forward, the diary held out like a trophy. "Smart man, Elias. I knew you." I didn't take the book. I took her wrist, gently but firmly, and led her back to the edge of the porch. "The foundation doesn't care about the diary, Claire," I said, "because the foundation isn't a house anymore. It's just a man. And that man is tired of holding things up." I took the diary from her hand. It felt light. It felt like nothing. "Get off my property," I said. "And Claire, the police are already on their way here to take my statement. I'll be sure to mention you were the one who brought me the evidence of my father's terminal fraud. You might get a lighter sentence for cooperating." The look of triumph on her face vanished, replaced by a hollow, guttural sob of realization. She backed away, her heels clicking on the stone path until she disappeared into the gray mist of the morning. I stood alone on the porch. I looked at the diary. I thought about the man who had written it. I thought about the man I had become to please him. I walked to the small fire pit at the side of the cottage. I took a match from my pocket and struck it. I watched the flame for a long time, small, fragile, and honest. I dropped it onto the pages. I didn't stay to watch it burn. I walked back to the main house. The sun was fully up now, but it was a cold, pale sun that offered no warmth. The news crews were gone, moved on to the courthouse where Silas and Martha were being processed. The sirens had faded. The house was empty. I walked through the foyer. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need them. I knew every inch of this place. I heard the ticking of the grandfather clock. Thump, tick, the heartbeat of a museum. I went into the kitchen. On the table sat the invisible cake note from Lily. I picked it up and held it to my chest. Children rarely notice a father disappearing until the things he paid for start disappearing with him. But Lily was the only one who had noticed I was still there. I walked up the stairs to the guest wing. I opened the door to the room where she was sleeping. The nanny was in the chair by the window, nodding off. She jolted awake when I entered.
"Mr. Vance," she whispered. "Is it over?"
"It's over," I said. I walked to the bed. Lily was curled into a ball, her small hand clutching a stuffed rabbit I'd bought her for her 3rd birthday. She looked so much like Julian used to look before the greed took root. I sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't wake her. I just watched her breathe. In the silence of that room, I realized that the Vance legacy wasn't the money, or the house, or the name on the gate. It wasn't the foundation I had tried so hard to protect. The legacy was this: the chance to grow up in a house where the truth didn't have to be a secret. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come home, Lily," I whispered. "The world was very heavy today." I stood up and walked to the window. I looked out over the valley. The glass house on the hill was swarming with forensic teams. My main house was a tomb of high-end furniture and bitter memories. I realized then that I didn't want any of it. I turned to the nanny. "Pack her things, just the basics. Her clothes, her books, that rabbit. We're leaving." "Where are we going, sir?" "To the valley," I said. "Not the estate. The 10 acres of timber I kept. There's a cabin there. It doesn't have a foundation of stone. It just sits on the earth." I walked out of the room and down the stairs for the last time. I didn't take my tools. I didn't take the Jaguar. I didn't take the photos of Martha or my sons. I walked to the front door and stepped out onto the porch. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key. I looked at it for a moment. The symbol of my ownership, my burden, my pride. I placed the key on the porch railing and walked down the steps. I didn't look back when I heard the heavy oak door click shut behind me, the lock engaging with a final metallic snap. The house was finally silent. As I walked toward the small silver sedan I'd hidden in the woods, the morning dew soaked into my shoes. My heart felt weary, yes. It felt old and battered and scarred. But for the first time in 65 years, it didn't feel like it was holding anything up. The world doesn't need a patriarch to hold it together. It just needs a man who knows when it's time to stop saving people who don't want to be saved. I got into the car and waited. A few minutes later, the nanny emerged from the house, carrying Lily in her arms. The child was half awake, rubbing her eyes. "Grandpa?" she called out as they reached the car. "I'm here, Lily," I said, opening the back door. "Did you get the cake?" I looked at the house, the 5-bedroom museum of my life, and then I looked at her. "No, honey," I said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across my face. "We're gonna go bake a real one." I started the engine and drove toward the gate. I didn't use the remote. I waited for the security guard to open it. As the iron bars swung wide, I drove through and didn't check the rearview mirror. The silence was no longer a haunting. It was a beginning. And as the car disappeared into the trees, The only sound left on the Vance estate was the ticking of the clock in the foyer, counting down the seconds in a house where nobody was left to listen. The cabin was not a sanctuary. It was a reckoning. It sat at the end of a long, unpaved road that wound through the skeletal remains of an old-growth forest. Here, the silence was different than the silence of the big house.
In the foyer of the Vance estate, the silence felt like a held breath, an artificial stillness bought with money and air conditioning. Here, the silence felt heavy, ancient, and indifferent to the name of the man who sought shelter within it. I spent the first 3 days in a state of clinical detachment. I moved through the small rooms of the cabin, my hands performing the tactile tasks of survival, chopping wood, boiling water, checking the perimeter fences, while my mind remained locked in a windowless room, replaying the look on Martha's face as the blue lights hit the glass house. Lily was resilient, but it was the resilience of a child who hadn't yet learned that the floor can fall away. She spent her afternoons in the small meadow behind the cabin, building fairy houses out of twigs and moss. She didn't ask about her father. She didn't ask about her mother. It was as if she sensed that their names were now thorns that would only draw blood if spoken aloud. But the world does not let a man like Elias Vance simply disappear. On the 4th morning, a black sedan pulled up the gravel drive. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't a news crew. It was Arthur. He looked 10 years older, his silk tie loosened, his eyes rimmed with the red fatigue of 72 hours of legal combat. He stepped out of the car, clutching a briefcase that looked like it weighed 100 pounds. He didn't say hello. He just looked at the cabin, then at me. "You're a hard man to find, Elias," he said, his voice raspy. "That was the intention, Arthur. The intention was a dream. The reality is a landslide." He walked toward the porch, his shoes caking with the red mud of the valley. "We need to talk." The ghost protocol triggered more than just a freeze. It triggered a bloodbath. We sat at the small pine table. I poured him a cup of coffee made from a percolator that hissed like a wounded animal. "Julian is talking," Arthur said, opening the briefcase. "But he's not talking to the police. He's talking to the press. He's filed a civil suit from his holding cell. He's claiming that you didn't just catch them. He's claiming you staged the entire night. He's telling the world that you're a narcissistic mastermind who lured your family to a remote location to manufacture evidence of a crime that never happened." I looked out the window. Lily was chasing a butterfly. "The video of the kerosene, Arthur? The audio of Martha's ledger? Those aren't manufacturing. In a court of public opinion, they are contextualized, Elias. Julian's lawyer is a shark named Kessler. He's painting you as a man suffering from persecutory delusion. He's using the fact that you've been living in a workshop for years as proof that you've been spiraling into a paranoid fantasy. He's arguing that the ghost protocol was a premeditated attack on your own children." Arthur leaned in, his voice dropping. "But that's not the worst of it. Martha is refusing to speak, but Silas is singing a very different song." "What song is that?" "The song about your father," Arthur said. He pulled out a yellowed piece of paper, a photocopy of a bank record from 1984. "Claire wasn't lying about the diary, Elias. I did some digging into the offshore accounts Silas was using. They didn't start with the embezzlement 20 years ago. They started 40 years ago. With your father." I felt the familiar coldness return to my marrow. "What did he do, Arthur?" "He didn't just save the company, Elias. He used Silas to do the dirty work of clearing the land for the Vance developments. There are records of displaced residents, payoffs to city officials. Your father wasn't the pillar of the community. He was the man who paid Silas to be the sledgehammer. Silas isn't just your brother. He's the keeper of the family's true foundation, and he's offering the DA a deal. The full history of the Vance family's crimes in exchange for a reduced sentence and a transfer to a minimum security facility. I looked at my hands. They were the hands of a man who had built a life on a foundation he thought was solid. Now, I realized I had just been the top layer of paint on a rotting structure. "If he talks," Arthur said, "the Lily Vance Foundation is over before it begins. The assets will be seized as part of a racketeering investigation. Everything you've worked for, everything you sacrificed your marriage and your sons for, it will all be gone. You'll be left with nothing but this cabin and the clothes on your back." "And what does Martha want?" I asked. "She wants a reconciliation," Arthur said, his lip curling in disgust. "She's sent word through her attorney. She'll testify against Silas. She'll say she was coerced into the drugging. She'll help you keep the money. But only if you drop the charges, reinstate the joint accounts, and move back into the main house. She wants the status quo back, Elias. She wants the mask." The psychological insight hit me with the force of a physical blow. A narcissist doesn't care if you know they're a monster, as long as you continue to pretend they are a saint in public. "She thinks I'll fold," I whispered. "She thinks I'm so afraid of losing the Vance name that I'll invite the poison back into my bed." "Will you?" Arthur asked. "Because the alternative is the total destruction of your father's memory. It's the public shaming of everything you've stood for 65 years. I stood up and walked to the door. I looked at Lily. She had caught the butterfly, but she was holding it so gently, her hands cupped like a prayer. Then, she opened her palms and let it go. I turned back to Arthur. "My father is dead," I said, "and the Vance name is a ghost. I spent 40 years protecting a lie. I'm not going to spend the next 40 protecting a tomb." "What are you going to do?" "Silas thinks he's the only one who knows where the bodies are buried," I said. "But he forgot that I was the one who did the accounting for the firm after Dad passed. I didn't see the crimes then because I didn't want to see them. But I still have the books, Arthur. All of them. In the safe deposit box you thought was empty. Elias, if you open those books, you go down with them. You were the CEO for the last 15 years. Ignorance isn't a legal defense at that level." "I know," I said. "But a foundation that is built on rot must be cleared away before you can build anything else, even if the builder has to go with it." I walked to the corner of the cabin and picked up my coat. "Tell Kessler that the persecutory delusion defense is going to have a hard time standing up against 40 years of forensic accounting. And tell Martha, tell her that she can keep the mask. But she's going to have to wear it in a courtroom, not in my house." As Arthur left, the dust from his car hanging in the air, I sat back down at the table. I realized then that the ghost protocol wasn't a trap for my family. It was a trap for me. I had thought I could cut them off and remain untouched, but you can't cut off a limb without bleeding. I reached for the phone. I had one more person to call. Someone who knew exactly what Silas had done in the 80s. Someone my father had paid to stay silent. It was time to talk to the displaced residents. The rain in the valley was different than the rain in the city. In the city, rain is a nuisance, something to be dodged under umbrellas and brushed off silk coats. Out here, the rain was a weight. It turned the earth into a heavy, clinging sludge that seemed determined to pull everything back down into the dirt. I drove the silver sedan to the edge of the old industrial district, a place where the skeletons of factories stood like tombstone markers for an era of production that had long since been replaced by the consulting and tech firms my sons used to drain the world dry. I stopped in front of a small, weather-beaten house on the corner of a street that no longer appeared on the digital maps. This was the Hollows, the neighborhood my father and Silas had effectively erased 40 years ago to make room for the Vance waterfront plaza. I stepped out of the car. The cold water soaked through my coat immediately. I didn't care. There is a certain comfort in finally being as cold as the truth you've been running from. I knocked on the door. It was opened by a woman whose face looked like a map of hard winters. Mrs. Gable. She was 80 now, her hands gnarled by a lifetime of labor, her eyes sharp and suspicious. "I told the lawyers to stop coming," she said, her voice like grinding stones. "The settlement was a pittance then, and it's a pittance now. Go away." "I'm not a lawyer, Mrs. Gable," I said, removing my hat. "My name is Elias Vance." She froze. The name hung in the air between us like a physical threat. She looked at me, not at my suit but at my eyes. She was looking for the man who had signed the final eviction notices 40 years ago. "The son," she whispered. "The one who stayed clean." "I didn't stay clean," I said. "I just stayed blind. There's a difference, though the result is the same. May I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. The house smelled of wood smoke and peppermint. It was tiny, but every surface was polished. On the mantel sat a photograph of a younger Mrs. Gable standing in front of a beautiful 3-story Victorian house. The house that used to stand where my father's legacy tower now sat. "Why are you here, Elias Vance? Your brother's people already tried to buy my silence again last month. They said the statute of limitations had passed, but they wanted to be charitable." "I'm not here to buy anything," I said, sitting in the chair she offered. "I'm here to give you something. But first, I need to know. What did my father do to your husband?" Mrs. Gable sat across from me. She didn't look at the photo. She looked at her hands. "He didn't do anything," she said softly. "That was the problem. He watched. He stood on the sidewalk in his fine wool coat, and he watched while Silas and his crew broke my husband's legs in the basement of our own home. They told him that if he didn't sign the deed, the next time they'd come for the children. Your father, he just checked his gold pocket watch. He said, 'Silas, we're going to be late for the charity gala.' And then they left." The room felt like it was tilting. I remembered that gold pocket watch. It was on my nightstand right now. My father had given it to me on the day I passed the bar exam. "To a man of timing and integrity," the engraving read. "I have the documents, Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. "The real ones, not the ones filed at the courthouse. I have the ledger Silas kept. It shows the payments my father made to the security firms that handled the displacement. It shows the kickbacks to the judges." "And what good does that do me now?" she asked, a flash of ancient anger sparking in her eyes. "My husband died in a wheelchair. My children grew up in a rental. Your legacy was built on our bones." "It does you no good," I admitted, "but it does the foundation harm, and right now, the foundation is the only thing the Vance family has left to hide behind. I'm going to release them. All of them. I'm going to make sure every family in the Hollows that was cheated receives a direct settlement from the estate before the lawyers can touch it." "You'll destroy yourself," she said. "The news says you're a hero." "If you put this out, you're just another Vance." "I am just another Vance," I said. "That's the realization I've been avoiding for 65 years. I thought I was the antidote. I was just the mask." I stood up. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was the gold pocket watch. I set it on her table. "Keep it," I said. "It's a reminder that timing is everything, and I'm 40 years late." I walked back out into the rain. I felt a strange, terrifying lightness. The Vance name wasn't just a burden, it was a cage, and I had just opened the door. But as I reached my car, a white SUV pulled up, blocking me in. The door opened, and Evelyn stepped out. She didn't have her designer handbag this time. She was wearing a trench coat, her hair matted by the rain, her face pale and sharp. She looked like a woman who had been through a war, and she was down to her last bullet.
"You really are going to do it, aren't you?" she shouted over the sound of the downpour. "You're going to burn it all down. You're going to take Marcus and Julian with you."
"They took themselves, Evelyn," I said, leaning against my car. "I'm just providing the matches." "I have something you don't know," she hissed, stepping closer. "Something Silas didn't tell you. Something Martha doesn't even know. I'm tired of secrets, Evelyn. This isn't a secret about the past, Elias. It's about the future. It's about Lily." I froze. "What about Lily?" "The educational trust Julian gambled away? He didn't just lose it to private lenders. He lost it to a man named Vane. Does that name ring a bell? It should. It's the name Silas used for his shell companies." The psychological insight hit me like a splash of ice water. The cruelest betrayal isn't the one that takes your past. It's the one that mortgages your grandchildren's future to pay for your children's sins. "Silas owns Lily's future, Elias," Evelyn said, a twisted, desperate smile appearing on her face. "Julian signed over the legal guardianship of her assets to Vane as collateral. If Silas goes to prison, he's going to liquidate the trust. Lily will have nothing. Not even the cabin. He's already filed the paperwork. He's holding her hostage from a jail cell." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "You hate me." "Because I want out," she screamed, her voice breaking. "I want a deal. I give you the login for the Vane accounts, the ones Julian didn't know were recording every transaction, and you make sure Marcus doesn't go to prison. You use your hero status to get him a plea. If you don't, I'll let Silas burn her down. I'll watch that little girl lose everything just to see the look on your face." I looked at the woman who was my daughter-in-law. I looked at the greed that had turned her into a hollowed-out husk of a human being. "You'd use a 7-year-old as a bargaining chip," I said softly. "I'm a Vance now, Elias," she said, her eyes cold. "I learned from the best." I looked at the rain. I looked at the house where Mrs. Gable was currently holding my father's watch. "The deal is this, Evelyn," I said. "You give me the login, right now, and I'll make sure Marcus stays out of prison. But you're going to disappear. You're going to sign a confession of your own involvement in the arson plot. And you're going to leave this state tonight. If I ever see your face again, Lily's trust will be the least of your worries." "You wouldn't," she whispered. "I just gave away $40 million to people my father hurt," I said, walking toward her. "I have nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous foundation you've ever stood on." She stared at me, the fear finally overriding the greed. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a thumb drive. "The logins are on here," she said, her voice trembling. "And the recordings of Julian and Silas. Everything." I took the drive. "The confession, Evelyn. Write it. Now. On the back of your car." I watched her write the words that would end her life as a socialite and start her life as a fugitive. When she was done, I took the paper and got into my car. I didn't go back to the cabin. I went to the one place where I could finish this. I went to the main house. I needed to talk to Martha one last time, not as her husband, but as her landlord. The main house stood like a tomb under the bruised purple of the twilight sky. I pulled the silver sedan up the drive, the headlights cutting through the mist. The for sale sign I'd authorized through the corporation was already gone, likely torn down by Julian before his arrest, or perhaps by Martha, who still clung to the delusion that walls could protect her from the truth. I walked up the front steps. I didn't use the key I'd left on the railing. I used the master code for the security system. The house hummed as the locks disengaged, a mechanical welcome that felt like a mockery. The foyer was dark. The air was stale, smelling of cold coffee and the metallic scent of a house that had been lived in by fear rather than love. I walked toward the kitchen. Martha was there. She was sitting at the island, a single lamp illuminating her. She wasn't wearing her caregiver cardigan anymore. She was dressed in a sharp black suit, the kind she wore to fundraisers. She looked like a widow who had already planned the wake. "I knew you'd come back, Elias," she said, her voice steady. She didn't look at me. She was staring at her wedding ring, which she'd placed on the counter. "You can't stay in that cabin. It's beneath you. You're a man of stature. You belong in the light." "I was never in the light, Martha," I said, walking to the other side of the island. "I was just the one holding the lamp so nobody could see the shadows." "The lawyer says the foundation can be challenged," she said, finally looking up. Her eyes were hard, polished like marbles. "The assets were built during our marriage. I'm entitled to half, and with the psychiatric evidence of your episodes, a judge will see that the donation was an act of a compromised mind. We can fix this, Elias. We can tell the world it was a misunderstanding, a health crisis. We can save the boys." "Save them for what? Another decade of theft? Another night of trying to burn me out of my own life?" "They're your blood," she hissed. "They're my shame," I replied. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the thumb drive Evelyn had given me. I slid it across the granite. "That drive contains the logins for Vane. It contains the records of Silas using Julian's business to launder the money he's been stealing from our accounts for 20 years. And more importantly, it contains the legal documents Silas had Julian sign, the ones that gave Silas total control over Lily's future." Martha's hand twitched toward the drive. "Silas didn't love you, Martha," I said softly. "He didn't see you. He used you as a lookout while he robbed our house. He was holding Julian and Marcus as insurance. If you ever turned on him, he would have destroyed them. And now he's going to do it anyway to save himself." I saw the first crack in the mask. Her lower lip trembled. He said the trust was safe. He said he was protecting the boys from your rigidity. He was protecting himself from accountability. And you helped him." I leaned in, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a sentence. "You gave a predator the keys to your children's lives because you were bored of being a wife. You were so desperate to be seen that you let a ghost blind you." She stared at the drive. The silence of the house seemed to press in on us. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the ghosts of 40 years of dinners we'd shared while she was secretly planning my end. "What do you want?" she whispered. "I want the truth, Martha. Not the one for the news, the one for me." I pulled the father's diary from my coat, the one I hadn't burned. I'd saved the final page. "Did you know about the boating accident? Did you know Silas wasn't on that boat?" She looked at the book. A slow, ugly smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a person who had finally been relieved of the burden of pretending to be good. "I bought the boat, Elias," she said. The world went still. "Your father came to me. He said Silas was a liability,
but a necessary one. He said the firm needed a martyr, and Silas needed a grave. I was the one who found the body for the morgue. I was the one who made sure the coroner didn't look too closely at the dental records. Your father didn't trust you with the lie, Elias. He knew you were too weak. So he trusted me. She stood up, leaning over the counter, her face inches from mine. I've been holding this family together for 20 years, Elias. I've been the one managing the rot while you played with your tools and pretended the world was made of cedar and oak. I am the foundation, not you. You're just the ornament on the roof. I looked at her. I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel betrayal anymore. I felt a profound, exhausting pity. A foundation that is built on a lie isn't holding the house up, I said. It's just waiting for the weight to become too much. And tonight, Martha, the house is empty. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I pressed a button. The police are in the laundry room, Martha. They've heard everything, including the confession about the boating accident and the obstruction of justice. The color drained from her face. She backed away from the counter, her eyes darting toward the door. You recorded me? In our home? It's not a home, I said, standing straight. It's a crime scene, and I'm finally closing the case. The laundry room door opened. Detective Miller stepped out, followed by 2 officers. They didn't move quickly. They moved with the heavy, somber pace of men attending a funeral.
Martha Vance, Miller said. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and obstruction of justice.
I watched as they put the handcuffs on her. She didn't scream, she didn't struggle. She just looked at me with a cold, dead stare. The look of a woman who had spent so long living in the shadows that the light was finally nothing more than an insult. As they led her past me, she leaned in and whispered, "You'll be alone, Elias. You'll die in that cabin, and nobody will even know you're gone. You've killed your own family." "I didn't kill them, Martha," I said, not looking at her. "I just stopped pretending they were alive." The house was silent again. I walked to the kitchen island and picked up the thumb drive. I looked at the wedding ring she'd left behind. A circle of gold that meant nothing. I walked to the front door. I didn't turn off the lights. I wanted the house to be seen. I wanted every window to glow, a beacon of truth for the city to see, before the darkness finally took it. I walked down the steps and got into the sedan. I had one more thing to do before I could go back to the valley. I had to go to the prison. I had to tell my sons that their mother was coming to join them.